It was a night where the moon seemed to watch over the valley, suspended in an inky sky, bright but silent, like a motionless sentinel sensing an imminent drama. Its silver glow bathed the crests of the surrounding mountains, casting moving shadows on the sleeping earth. At the edge of these imposing peaks, where the wind whistled between the rocks like a murmur laden with warnings that no one deigned to hear, nestled an isolated village named Soutilé. The inhabitants of Soutilé lived in a prosperity envied by many regions. Their fields, caressed by rich, black soil, yielded harvests so abundant that the granaries overflowed each autumn. The village artisans, with their skilled hands and ancestral knowledge, forged tools, wove fabrics, and carved objects so refined that their renown extended to distant cities. The herds also prospered. The cows gave creamy milk, the sheep thick wool, and the hens laid golden eggs in abundance. Everything seemed to smile on Soutilé, but this abundance, like an overripe fruit, had a bitter reverse side. It had slowly poisoned the souls of its inhabitants. Once, Soutilé was a place where hospitality reigned supreme. Travelers found a bed, a hot meal, and sincere smiles. Doors remained open, as did hearts. But over the generations, wealth had sown seeds of mistrust. Hospitality had withered, replaced by a glacial selfishness. The inhabitants, once generous, now saw every stranger as a threat, a potential thief come to plunder their treasures. Wickedness had taken root, and with it, a cold cruelty towards anyone who dared cross the village boundaries. Stories circulated in the neighboring valleys. It was said that no one came to Soutilé without leaving with a broken heart, a wounded soul, or worse, a body marked by violence. Strangers were not only unwelcome, they were chased away, sometimes to the point of bloodshed. It was whispered that an imprudent traveler risked leaving his life there, abandoned to the wolves or the elements by a pitiless populace. Soutilé had become a fortress of stone and even harder hearts. It was in this austere setting, on the eve of a rumbling storm, that a stranger made his entrance. The sky had darkened well before dusk that evening. Heavy clouds, swollen with imminent rain, piled up over the mountains, torn by fleeting flashes of lightning. The rain began to fall, first in timid drops, then in a furious deluge that transformed the dusty alleys of Soutilé into muddy rivers. Thunder rolled in the distance, a deep echo that seemed to announce an even greater anger. The villagers, safe in their thick-walled houses, had closed their shutters and lit their fireplaces. The wind howled through the cracks, but they remained deaf to its cries, preferring the comfort of their homes to the chaos outside. It was then that a figure emerged from the darkness, at the end of the main path that snaked through the village. Under the downpour, he advanced slowly, like a ghost defying the storm. He was a young man, frail and ragged, whose soaked clothes clung to his skin like a worn second skin. His black hair, plastered to his face by the rain, half-masked his features drawn by fatigue. Each step seemed to cost him an immense effort, his worn boots sinking into the mud with a dull thud. He almost staggered, but a silent determination still carried him. He stopped in front of the first house, a sturdy building with windows lit by an orange glow. Raising a trembling hand, he knocked on the door. A silence followed, then the door opened a crack. An old woman with a wrinkled face and piercing eyes appeared in the opening. "What do you want?" she barked in a hoarse voice. Without waiting for an answer, she spat. "Go away. We have nothing for you." The door slammed violently, making the wood vibrate. The stranger did not flinch. He moved to the next house, then the next, repeating his humble and desperate gesture. Each time, the answer was the same. Stinging insults, looks filled with contempt, doors slammed shut with rage. A man, bare-chested despite the cold, opened his window and threw a stone that grazed his shoulder. "Go back where you came from, vagabond," he yelled before disappearing into the shadow of his dwelling. The words rained down as harshly as the downpour, but the young man continued, unperturbed, as if driven by an invisible force. Exhausted, shivering under the weight of his waterlogged clothes, He finally reached the last house in the village, at the edge of Soutilé, where the lights were scarce. It was a modest dwelling, much less imposing than the others, but a warmth seemed to emanate from it despite the storm. It belonged to the potter, a discreet man whose kindness contrasted with the somber mood of his neighbors. He was often mocked for his weakness, for his refusal to close his heart like the others. But that night, this difference would change his destiny. When a stranger knocked on his door, the potter, busy shaping a jug near his kiln, raised his head. He exchanged a glance with his wife, who was cradling their youngest child near the fire. For a moment, he hesitated. The rumors about strangers, the village's warnings, weighed on his shoulders. But a rumble of thunder, closer this time, seemed to decide him. He put down his tool and walked to the door, which he opened cautiously. Before him stood the young man, a pitiful figure in the driving rain. His eyes, a deep gray, met those of the potter, and a wave of compassion overwhelmed the craftsman. "Come in, traveler," he said in a soft but firm voice. "You are soaked to the bone and exhausted. We will help you." Inside, the house came to life. The potter's wife placed the child in his cradle and hurried to revive the fire. The two older children, a boy and a girl, ran to fetch blankets and dry clothes from a worn trunk. Together, they prepared a hot bath in a wooden basin, pouring the steaming water with care. Meanwhile, the potter handed a bowl of soup, a simple mixture of potatoes, onions, and herbs, to the traveler, who had sat down near the hearth. The flames danced on his face, revealing features that were young but marked by ancient suffering. He ate in silence, his trembling hands clutching the bowl like a treasure. The night wore on, and the storm seemed to subside a little, although the wind continued to moan outside. The stranger, warmed and invigorated, suddenly put down his bowl and stood up abruptly, as if pulled by an urgency that only he perceived. "I must leave now," he declared, his voice low but imbued with an unexpected gravity. The potter frowned, perplexed. "Stay until morning," he insisted. "The storm is still strong, and you have barely rested." His wife nodded, adding, "There is a corner near the fire for you. You are not bothering us." But the stranger shook his head. He fixed his gaze on the potter, a gaze so intense, so penetrating, that it seemed to pierce his soul. "No, I cannot stay," he replied. "But listen to me carefully, you who opened your door to me. Leave tonight with your family. Do not wait for the cock's crow. If you stay here, you too will be caught in what is about to happen." A shiver ran down the potter's spine. These words, spoken with a cold certainty, were not a mere warning. They carried the weight of a prophecy. Troubled, he questioned the man with his eyes, but the man turned away, picking up his still damp rags. Without another word, he stepped through the door and disappeared into the night, swallowed by the darkness and the rain. The potter remained motionless for a moment, the stranger's words echoing in his mind. His wife approached, placing a hand on his arm. "What are we going to do?" she murmured. He took a deep breath, then turned to her. "We are leaving," he said simply. I don't know what he meant, but I feel he spoke the truth. In haste, the family gathered a few belongings, clothes, a loaf of bread, the potter's tools wrapped in a cloth. The children, still sleepy, did not protest, sensing the urgency in their parents' actions. Before leaving the village, the potter decided to warn his neighbors. He ran from house to house, knocking on doors with force, his voice tearing through the tumult of the storm. "Listen to me," he cried. "We must leave. That man was not a mere beggar. Something terrible is going to happen." But his calls were met with mocking laughter or annoyed grunts. "More of your stories, Potter," a man shouted from his doorstep before slamming the door shut. "If you want to follow that madman, do it, but leave us alone," added a woman, throwing a bucket of cold water out her window. Others did not even bother to answer, their figures motionless behind the closed shutters. Seeing that he could not convince them, the potter rejoined his family. Together, they moved away from Soutilé, their steps heavy in the mud, the rain lashing their faces. They walked for a long time, until the flickering lights of the village were nothing more than a distant memory, swallowed by the darkness. A strange silence then fell over Soutilé. Around midnight, the storm ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The clouds dispersed, leaving the moon to reign alone in a clear sky. Its pale glow illuminated the deserted streets, the roofs glistening with moisture, the closed windows. The inhabitants slept soundly, lulled by the warmth of their hearths, unaware of the shadow that hovered above them. But when the first ray of sunlight pierced the horizon, everything changed. An invisible force, swift as the wind and silent as death, swept through Soutilé. It struck without warning, without sound. The women who rose to stoke their ovens, the men who pulled on their boots for the fields, the children who laughed as they chased a cat in the yard, all were frozen in place. Their bodies stiffened in an instant, transformed into gray stone statues, their expressions petrified in a mix of surprise, anger, or indifference. Even the animals did not escape the fate. Dogs froze in mid-bark, birds perched on roofs became frozen silhouettes, their wings forever closed. A terrifying silence enveloped the village. Soutilé was nothing more than a macabre tableau, a stone cemetery where time itself seemed to have breathed its last. The fields remained intact, the houses standing, but all life had vanished, replaced by a motionless eternity. Years passed, and Soutilé became a legend whispered around campfires. Some said the village still existed, hidden in a secret valley, protected by a mist that only pure hearts could pass through. Others claimed to have heard the statues murmur in the night, voices full of regrets escaping from their frozen lips, imploring the winds for forgiveness. The boldest swore they had seen the stranger reappear near the ruins, his shadow wandering among the stones, a silent judge watching over his work. As for the potter and his family, they settled in a distant land, near a peaceful river. There, he resumed his craft, shaping simple but sturdy pots, while his children grew up in a world where hospitality was not crime. Often, around the table, they told the story of that strange night, of that beggar with deep eyes who had saved them. Was he a man? An angel? An entity sent to test human souls? No one knew, but one thing was certain. His coming had revealed the hidden truth in the hearts of Soutilé. And you, traveler who reads these lines, what would you do if a stranger knocked on your door in the middle of the night? The rain drums, the wind groans, and a trembling figure stands on the threshold. Would you open, offering warmth and shelter, or would you turn away, letting the storm take him? Think carefully, for who knows, perhaps that beggar carries within him a message, a truth that only destiny, in its implacable justice, will one day reveal.